While you're eating, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our keynote speaker, Assistant Secretary of Commerce and Export Administration Kevin Wolf. Rightly recognized as one of the nation's leading authorities on export controls, Assistant Secretary Wolf was sworn into office on February 2010, prior to which he practiced international trade law for nearly 17 years in the Washington, D.C. office of Bryan Cave, LLP. He holds a BA degree from the University of Missouri-Columbia and a master's from the University of Minnesota's Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs and a JD from the University of Minnesota Law School. In his current role, Assistant Secretary Wolf helps to oversee the national security, non-proliferation, foreign policy, national defense, and strategic industrial resource functions delegated to BIS, which include issues related to the Export Administration regulations. He's one of the key architects of export control reform, and we are privileged to have him with us today to discuss reform. And before we welcome him to the stand, he did say that he's hoping for a very informal discussion, so as he shares topics and comments, feel free to raise your questions. And with that, Secretary Wolf, thank you.
Thank you. I realize export compliance and working through our proposed rules can be rather stressful. And apologies for those of you who know this technique, but I'll just pass it along for how to deal with the stress. When I was a child and I would do things that would stress out my father, he would slowly start counting to 20. 1, 2, sort of about that speed. And then he would lift my head out of the water, and we'd talk about it and everything would be fine. So I just give you that sort of practitioner's tip to take back with you when working through everything that we're proposing and export compliance in general. No, so anyway, thanks for having me. I always look forward to the opportunity to go out and talk to the public, particularly those that use the word exciting and Category 11 revisions in the same sentence, as I heard a moment ago. Normally that doesn't enter into the lexicon. So, and as was said, I'm happy to answer whatever questions, because the goal of these kinds of talks, particularly with respect to the this group, is to get public comment back and reactions and suggestions on some of the rules that we're proposing. You already had Mike Lachek here earlier, and between Peter's talk and some of the other panel, you probably have pretty good detail about of what we're up to. Let me do this. Let me give you just a little bit of the context and the purpose and the reason and the justification for why we're doing a reform effort, and then briefly, I mean, there's a 3-hour version and a 15-minute version, and then dive into the weeds a little bit on some of the category revisions and give you a status report, and then leave it open to as many of the questions as you want to raise, and we'll take it from there. So the purpose for why the administration has set out to fundamentally reform the export control system is still best laid out in a speech that then Secretary of Defense Gates gave in April of 2010. And in that speech, he said that national security required a fundamental reform of the system. And what he described in that speech is that this national security word that's thrown around a lot had basically 3 elements to it. We needed to have a system that increased interoperability with our close allies, and certainly didn't hinder it, as it does in many ways now, and he gave several examples of that in his speech. A system that enhances and strengthens the U.S. defense industrial base by eliminating whatever incentives exist in the current system to design out or avoid U.S. origin content or services, which is an aspect of the see-through rule, as many of you have heard about, and something I can describe in just a moment. And a system that allows the government, with its limited resources, to focus those resources on the types of transactions that matter most. And it's much more in our national security interest to be able to have a more efficient system for those types of transactions for export to our close allies or for ultimate end use by our close allies. We should be spending less times on those types of transactions that we spend, approve 100% of our time rarely with conditions, and spend more time on the other types of transactions to other countries or other uses or for other kinds of items. And so anyway, those are the three essential purposes from a national security perspective that Secretary Gates laid out. And everything that we're doing in this complex system between the ITAR and the EAR that was described earlier is really meant to try to create or to implement that vision. And that's been carried forward by Secretary Panetta, and the President has directly instructed us in this regard. If you were at our update conference about 2 years ago, there was a recorded introduction from President Obama, and he referred to the commodity jurisdiction process. I mean, how many presidents prior to that have gotten down into the weeds on something as nerdy as the CJ process? But the CJ process is, an example of each of these three topics and why reform is needed, because a massive amount of time is spent, certainly by the government, but even more so by the industry, in trying to work through the jurisdictional status of particular items. And what Secretary Gates said in his speech is that it's more important to control things by what they are and what they're capable of and what their significance is and how critical or not they are to national security than so much time spent on who governs what. So the way in which to accomplish each of these objectives, in light of some of the limitations in the Arms Export Control Act on creating country groups, was to use the already existing structure of the Commerce Control List, the regulations that exist under the authority of, or the list of controlled items in the Export Administration Regulations under the authority of IEPA, which is a much broader statutory authority. And that structure has country groups, has exceptions, has a structure for more right-sizing and tailoring controls based on the significance of a particular item. So in a group that was largely led by Mike Lachak, who spoke earlier, was just done a terrific job, the Defense Department was given the task in 2010 and running into 2011 of going through the entire U.S. munitions list and identifying those items that warranted USML control, that warranted effectively the one-size-almost-fits-all items where licenses required from most countries with a few exceptions for Canada. And what are those types of items that the Defense Department wanted to have complete visibility into from a licensing perspective, even for trade with close allies and for ultimate government end use for close allies. For anything else that the Defense Department didn't identify, didn't put into its proposed revisions to the list of controlled military items on the U.S. munitions list, those items wouldn't be decontrolled. There's still a reason for exercising a degree of control over them, given their nature as items specially designed for military applications. But there are some types of military items that are less significant or less sophisticated, and are the types of items that we want to aggressively and quickly and more easily get for ultimate government use by the close allies. And all of those items, anything that wasn't listed on the U.S. munitions list by the Defense Department, would become subject to the jurisdiction of the EAR, the Export Administration Regulations, to which this large license exception that we've proposed, strategic trade authorization, would apply, as well as some of the other structural aspects of the EAR. So where we are is, or I'll give you a summary of the status and then where we are. So after the Defense Department finished its review of most of the categories, and we still have a little bit of work left to do on two of the categories, categories 12 and 14, night vision and biologics. But for essentially all of the other categories, the Defense Department finished its review over the course of last year and the early part of this year. And what the Commerce Department and the State Department have been doing is publishing 2 by 2, one state proposed revision, one Commerce proposed rule listing the new controls on the items, and seeking public comment. And all of this was right after what we published in July of last year that set up the structural framework for the amendments to the Export Administration Regulations that would allow for the control in the EAR of items that by definition were either inherently military or specially designed for military applications. I really do have a 3-hour version of this and a 3-day version of this, but I'll keep it brief. But in essence, what we did was we used the existing Commerce Control List structure to create a whole new series of controls for anything that was once on the U.S. munitions list that the Defense Department didn't identify as warranting control on the USML, and that's called the 600 series, and that's just one of the series of items that is subject to controls on the Commerce Control List. That list, by the way, is often traditionally known as a dual-use list, but it's always been a bit of a misnomer since it has always controlled some things that are exclusively for military applications, some things that are purely civilian and for other purposes. It's sort of the list of controlled items. So if something is controlled by the Department of Energy or the Nuclear Regulatory Commission or the Department of Agriculture, those lists and those regulations govern those items. And the Commerce Control List is the collection of all other things that for one reason or another, whether foreign policy or national security or crime control, that isn't caught on one of those other lists, including the U.S. munitions list, then it's controlled. The upside of that is you have a control list in one place. The downside of that is you end up creating a very complex set of controls because in an effort to right-size controls and to address different international commitments for different kinds of items for different countries, it ends up in a degree of complexity. And that's actually one of the things that we seek public comment on in what we're doing. If in our effort to make the U.S. munitions list shorter that we're making it longer, are we doing so in a way that makes sense and is clear and readable? So we published the structural rule last July. We published the first couple of categories, including the aircraft and the engines category in November of last year. About a dozen other publications over the course of earlier part of this year. In June of this year, we published a second proposed definition of specially designed, which is a catch-all phrase that has lots of emotion and passion and history behind it, but it's critical to define clearly, given that a key element of this is that we control properly that which is today USML controlled, and frankly resolve 30 years of fighting about exactly what that term means. We also published another rule that would we call internally the transition rule, which would describe how things today that are ITAR controlled that tomorrow or commerce controlled would move when you have licenses or other authorizations. Go ahead and eat, by the way. You don't, if you're not talking because of me, or you're getting food. Food is being delivered. Okay, you don't have food. That's why. I just saw the cake, and I thought you'd already had. So you're waiting for the turkey, or chicken rather. Sorry, chicken in a hotel. I'm stunned. Wow. And what was I saying? All right, and also this rule contained a whole series of amendments to the existing exemptions within the EAR to try to harmonize them with the ITAR. A result of these two export control systems sort of evolving separately and independently and without much communication over the years is that they came up with very different ways of articulating the same basic concepts. And as part of this effort, the broader reform effort of ultimately getting one day to a place where we can have a single list with a single set of regulations that are all coherent, we're trying to, in the meantime, which will require legislation, we're trying to, in the meantime, at least harmonize a lot of the terms and phrases and concepts between the ITAR and the EAR. And ideas are sort of flowing in both directions. And the ITAR has adopted some of the EAR's ideas in terms of definitions of knowledge and development and production, and then more moving in the other direction. The EAR is adopting a lot of the defined terms and licensing and exception provisions, rather, that are in the ITAR. So for this group, where we are is that in about 2 weeks ago, November 28th, we published proposed revisions to U.S. munitions list category 11, and that's the group that our state did. That's the category that controls military electronics. And then also the Commerce Department at the same time published the proposed new control numbers called export control classification numbers that would control all electronics that are today ITAR controlled that would tomorrow be subject to the EAR, i.e. those that weren't specifically identified on the U.S. munitions list. And it's out for public comment. Our normal rule is 45 days, but Bob Cratchit style, we decided to give you 15 more days. So there's a 60-day comment period, whatever that, I think it's whatever 60 days is from November 28th, I think. Who's figured that out? Is it, what would that be, January something? The end of January. I'll find out the exact date. And we really do want you to read these closely and let us know if what we've described is clear, whether it makes sense, whether it's consistent with the philosophy that I've just described, whether it will work to cleanly divide that which is ITAR and that which is EAR, whether it will more right-sized controls of less significant items that are more widely available, that are routinely approved for exports to our close allies as the type of items that don't necessarily warrant control on the USML, whatever you want to say, whether it works, whether it doesn't, whether it's a good idea, it's a bad idea, whether you can make a little word change here to make it more clear. If there's a phrase we use that doesn't make any sense or we have an unintended consequence, let us know. To sort of help with people preparing their public comments, we're doing something a little unusual. I hold a conference call every Wednesday where we take in whatever written comments people have about the proposed rules, and I answer them on the phone. I only answer the questions asked. I don't just sort of start spewing off, generally. So our motivation behind that is that if the more people that understand the rules better, which is why I'm grateful that you all came together to have this discussion, that enables better public comments, which then helps our mission of getting better rules. It's more time-consuming that way, but it's more transparent, and I think we, in the end, get a better work product than if we had just done it internally ourselves without as much industry input from what we came up with. I mean, a perfect example of that is when we published the aircraft engine rules. Right now, military aircraft engines are caught in USML Category 8B, and so last November we published a proposed rule between those that would remain on the USML and those military aircraft engines that would become subject to this new 600 series. When we were trying to think of discriminators, nice clean discriminators between civil and military aircraft or significant and less significant military aircraft engines, we used the phrase engines capable of inverted flight. And in our minds, when we were drafting this, and by we, I mean the Defense Department, State Department, Commerce Department, and at the Defense Department, it was their aircraft and engine experts. That seemed like a nice bright line because we don't normally associate civilian aircraft engines with those that are capable of inverted flight. We were surprised in the public comments that came back that all of the aircraft engine manufacturers says, well, actually all of our civil aircraft engines that are used today are capable of inverted flight. Not for very long, but they are indeed capable of inverted flight. So that was we've come up with, we took into account their comments. We added in a 30-second variable with a G-force ratio, something to accommodate. But that's a perfect example of where industry looking closely at what we wrote and sort of seeing the spirit and purpose of what we're after, helping us think through a way to articulate it more cleanly. On the flip side, there were a lot of industry comments on other topics that went way too far that we don't accept, but those that are helpful to the objective and for making a clearer rule, we appreciate that. So as was described earlier, and I'll just get to the summary here and then we can start talking about substance. What we did with electronics is, did Lechik already describe all this? Right now, USML 11 is one of the broadest in terms of a catch-all type of a category. There's very little specific detail as to what types of military electronics are controlled in USML 11. 11A essentially says that any equipment specially designed or modified for a military application is controlled under the ITAR without any other detail, and there are some examples, but it's a really broad catch-all phrase. 11B is any equipment, electronic equipment for intelligence or surveillance type law enforcement related applications. But again, some examples, but not a lot of detail. And then 11C is really broad. 11C just says parts, components, accessories, or attachments specifically designed or modified for an 11A or an 11B item, except those in normal commercial use. And again, no lists or no details. So as part of this effort, and that catches everything from a very basic connector that was in any way modified for a piece of military electronics that's essentially the same as any other connector, but it's unique in terms of its form or fit for the military application, to some very sophisticated radar components. And there's no distinction. They're controlled and treated exactly the same way. If you go down to the Smithsonian and you go into the Air and Space Museum and you see all these World War II and World War I era aircraft, any of those components that are unique or specific or specially designed for those aircraft are controlled exactly the same way as the parts specially designed or modified for the Joint Strike Fighter or any of the other modern aircraft that we have. And so in the effort to right-size this, what you have to do is be able to describe what it is that you want to control. Electronics was one of the hardest, it's actually the third hardest intellectually of the categories to think through. Two others, the two that are tougher are the night vision topic and the category 14 dealing with biologics. We're still working on getting our brain around exactly the right approach on those two categories. But one reason why 11 was a lot later in the queue for publication is not because it's small. In fact, it's the second largest by far of all of the categories in terms of volume of exports. There are, Bob Kovac, who's the director of DDTC, talks about how there are 11,000 licenses a year just for parts and components that get caught in that 11C catch-all that I described. And to put that in perspective, the Commerce Department processed 22,000 licenses of all categories of all items last year. And the number one subcategory, by the way, on the USML is 8H, dealing with military aircraft parts. And in that generic catch-all category of 8H, there were 15,000 licenses last year. So just for the generic catch-all categories for aircraft and for electronics, there were more individual licenses, and the dollar values are dramatically higher than the entire universe of things that the Commerce Department controlled and processed licenses for last year. So rather significant in terms of volume, but difficult in terms of intellectual exercise. So there was a significantly large group of people from the Defense Department who worked, the better part of a year, going up until when did we sort of finish the work in Maine? It was probably June or so. And by Defense Department, I mean not just DITSA, but all of the services and the Naval Research Lab and the intelligence agencies as well. And it was sort of put to them, what are the types of electronics by description? You can't just say military electronics that are significant such that you would want visibility into transactions even with respect to close allies. And they started putting together lists, and then they would submit them to their management at the Defense Department that would sort of organize them. And then over the course of a series of all-day meetings down at the Defense Department, these experts with me and with Bob Kovac from Defense and from State and from Commerce would go through, and they would present and describe, and we try to come up with the way in which to articulate in the proposed rules what should be controlled. And so then that resulted in the content of the revision to Category 11, which with a couple of exceptions is a positive list of end items and parts and components that would remain USML. And then anything that is today on Category 11 would tomorrow be controlled by this new series on the Commerce Control List, and the number would be 3A611. And that ECCN structure is a way in which to try to conform something to both the Wassenaar munitions list and the existing Commerce Control List structure. So the 3 in that group would be tracking the categories within the Commerce Control List for the types of items at issue. So in our list, in the Commerce Control List, Category 3 is electronics, so that would be the first digit. And then the second digit is an A, B, C, D, or E, and those are called groups that tell you what the kind of item it is. So if it's an A, you know it's a physical item. The B is production and test equipment. The C is materials. The D is software for those types of items. And then the E is technology for those items. So we created a 3A, a 3B, a 3C, a 3D, and a 3E structure. And then the third digit, the 6, tracks the 600 series that I referred to, which tells you that it's something that used to be on the USML. And then the last 2 digits are the numbers that track the Wassenaar munitions list numbering structure. So everything that we are doing, we're remaining consistent with our international obligations. And one of those obligations is to remain consistent in control to some degree, although there's discretion as to when licenses or exceptions are permitted. But for the sake of multinationals and to have some logic to it, the last 2 digits track the Wassenaar munitions list numbering structure. So 11, Category 11, is how that ends. So you have a new 3A611, 3B611, 3D611, 3E611, et cetera. And within that new ECCN structure, it will have, in the first primary subparagraph A, will be any end item, any piece of equipment that's specially designed for military use. Basically, we just transferred the 11A of the broad catch-all for equipment to 3A611.A. So wherein there's a positive list of items on the USML, then we would keep the catch-all phrase on the Commerce Control List. And then if there are particular items that warrant being called out, then that's what the subparagraphs are used for. And then throughout all of our new categories, we're using .x as a subparagraph that then controls all other parts, components, accessories, and attachments that are somehow specially designed for anything that's in that category or on the U.S. munitions list that isn't otherwise specifically called out. And so in that way, we allow for a positive list, worldwide control, clearly identifying what remains ITAR controlled on the USML, and not decontrolling anything else, but allowing for anything that's on this new list to be eligible for export under this license exception, strategic trade authorization that I meant, and to be available for application of something called a de minimis concept, which the EAR has, but the State Department rules do not. And under the State Department rules, that something, no matter how insignificant, whatever its size or shape, if it's subject to the ITAR, it was modified, for a military application, that remains a defense article, remains ITAR controlled, even if it's incorporated into a foreign-made item or a commercial item. So you have, a foreign-made piece of electronics. You're a U.S. company that makes a little tiny connector or transistor or some other particular item. Even though the U.S. origin content of that foreign-made item is 1%, its re-export forever thereafter is subject to the jurisdiction of the State Department by virtue of having that U.S. origin ITAR-controlled content in it. And under the Commerce Department rule, it allows for a de minimis treatment of if it's less than 25% by value, then U.S. law doesn't apply to the re-export of that end item. If something is so significant that it warrants de minimis treatment, no de minimis treatment, that is, no matter how small or insignificant it is, if it's so important that the U.S. government wants to have visibility into it, even if incorporated into a foreign-made end item, that was one of the variables that factored into the Defense Department decision to identify it on the revised U.S. munitions list. Then the other primary exception is with respect to China and other countries subject to an arms embargo. Although this 25% de minimis rule is available worldwide, that's worldwide except for countries that are in the 126.1 list of countries, which are China and other countries subject to an arms embargo. And in those cases, the de minimis rule will be 0. So if, for example, you have a piece of U.S. origin content specifically designed or modified for a military end item, and that's incorporated into a foreign-made end item, just like today, where a U.S. government license would be required to re-export that foreign-made end item to China and would be presumptively denied. Tomorrow, under the commerce system, that same concept and same rule would apply with similar penalty structures for violation of that obligation. So that's what we put out for public comment. With respect to printed circuit boards, as probably was already described some in detail this morning, we put those in USML 11C under the general heading of the specific list of parts or components, and it's as follows, so it doesn't say including. And I guess it's under C, little room C2, printed circuit boards or patterned multi-chip modules for which the layout is specially designed for defense articles in this subchapter. A couple of things. Defense article is the term of art for anything that's identified on the U.S. munitions list. It does. So if it's not listed on the U.S. munitions list and its printed circuit board isn't especially designed for it, then it wouldn't be caught by here. Somebody asked me earlier, what is a patterned multi-chip module? And this came from the DoD experts, and I'd have to go back and ask, but how it was described to me is that was a type of printed circuit board that was a broader phrase than printed circuit boards. But if that's not clear to industry experts, just like my capable of inverted flight example with engines, then by all means, let us know. So anyway, so anything that wouldn't meet that definition, and it was electronics and it was somehow modified for a defense article or another military end item, then that would still be caught by the same catch-all phrase in each of the .x controls that I mentioned. So every part, component, accessory, attachment, even if not otherwise identified, that's specially designed for a defense article would still be controlled, but just under the commerce system, under those new catch-alls that we're creating. That's what we've proposed, and that's what we look forward for comment. And with that, I'll stop talking and sort of open it up to questions, Frank.